The funniest part was that nobody in the room realized they were laughing at the smartest person there. The laughter started near the back of the laboratory, not loud enough to stop the meeting, but loud enough to spread. A few smiles appeared, then a few more. Within seconds, several young engineers were trying to hide their amusement as a man pushing a custodial cart paused beside a glass wall and glanced toward a cluster of computer screens. Daniel Brooks noticed it immediately. He always did. People thought janitors did not pay attention. That assumption had followed him for years. Yet Daniel simply offered a polite nod and continued pushing the cart. The polished floor reflected the bright white lights hanging above the research facility. Around him, dozens of scientists, engineers, contractors, and visitors moved through the building carrying tablets, laptops, and technical reports. It was one of the most advanced aerospace research centers in the country, and Daniel was the man responsible for making sure the hallways stayed clean. At least that was what everyone believed. "Hey, buddy," one of the younger engineers called out. Daniel stopped. "Yes." The engineer pointed toward a massive display showing a complex simulation. "Any thoughts on orbital mechanics?" Several people chuckled. Daniel smiled politely. "Probably more than you would expect." That answer created even more laughter. The engineer grinned. "Good one." Daniel nodded once and continued down the hallway. He never argued, never defended himself, never tried to prove anything. Experience had taught him that people usually saw what they expected to see. If they expected a custodian, that was all they would notice. Behind the glass walls, a delegation from NASA had arrived earlier that morning. Their visit had transformed the normally busy facility into something closer to controlled chaos. Security personnel stood at several checkpoints. Engineers rushed between conference rooms. Senior managers reviewed presentations repeatedly. Somewhere inside the building, decisions were being discussed that could influence future aerospace projects worth millions of dollars. Daniel knew because he had overheard fragments of conversations while emptying trash bins and cleaning conference rooms before sunrise. He also knew something else. Most of the people making those decisions were exhausted. Tired people missed details. Tired people made mistakes. Tired people often confused confidence with competence. Daniel pushed his cart into another corridor and quietly resumed work. The scent of industrial cleaner mixed with fresh coffee drifting from a nearby break room. Outside, autumn sunlight reflected against the enormous windows lining the facility. It should have been an ordinary day, yet something felt different. Across town, a 10-year-old girl named Emily Brooks sat in a classroom drawing rockets in the margins of her notebook. Her teacher would eventually tell her to focus on math. Emily would smile because the rockets were part of the math. They always were. Her father had taught her that. Every trajectory told a story. Every launch began with a calculation. Every dream needed direction. Few people knew how often Daniel and Emily spent evenings studying together at their small kitchen table. They did not have expensive hobbies. They did not take luxury vacations. Most nights involved homework, frozen pizza, and library books. Yet those evenings mattered. They were the best part of Daniel's life. Back at the research center, the NASA delegation moved toward a secure conference room. Engineers hurried after them, carrying data packets and presentation materials. Daniel stepped aside to let them pass. One of the visitors briefly glanced at him before continuing forward. Nothing unusual, nothing memorable, just another custodian standing beside a wall. Daniel resumed cleaning. As he worked, his eyes drifted toward a nearby monitor displaying technical information. Numbers, models, simulations, equations. He looked away after only a second. Old habits were difficult to explain. Some people listened to music while they worked. Daniel noticed patterns. Near lunchtime, the facility cafeteria filled with conversation. The NASA visitors occupied one section. Senior executives occupied another. Daniel sat alone near a window with a sandwich packed from home. He opened a worn notebook resting beside his lunch tray. Page after page contained handwritten equations, diagrams, calculations, and observations. Years of work hidden behind an ordinary cover. Before he could continue writing, a shadow crossed the table. Daniel looked up. Two engineers stood nearby. One pointed toward the notebook. "What is that?" Daniel closed it gently. "Just notes." The engineer smiled. "Rocket science." His friend laughed. Daniel considered the question. Then he smiled. "Something like that." More laughter followed as the two men walked away. Daniel returned to his sandwich without another word. Through the cafeteria windows, bright sunlight illuminated the facility grounds. Inside, nobody noticed the quiet man sitting alone. Nobody realized that before the next day ended, NASA would begin searching the entire building for the person behind a solution nobody else could find. That evening, long after the engineers had gone home and the conference rooms had emptied, Daniel Brooks pulled his aging pickup truck into the parking lot of a modest apartment complex on the edge of the city. The engine rattled once before falling silent. For a moment he remained behind the wheel, watching the last traces of sunset fade beyond rows of brick buildings. It had been a long day. Then again, most days were. A smile appeared on his face when he noticed a familiar silhouette waiting near the second-floor window. Emily. The moment she spotted the truck, she disappeared from view. Daniel laughed softly because he already knew what would happen next. By the time he reached the apartment door, it flew open. "You are late." Emily stood with her hands on her hips, trying very hard to look serious. "Hello to you too. I timed it." "That sounds dangerous." "You were 12 minutes late." Daniel stepped inside and placed his backpack near the door. "Then I suppose I owe you 12 minutes. Emily nodded immediately. That is how contracts work. The apartment was small but warm. Family photographs covered one wall. School projects occupied another. The kitchen table sat near a window overlooking the parking lot. It was not much by most standards, but Daniel had spent years making it feel like home. "How was school?" he asked. "Excellent." "Why?" "I got extra credit." Daniel smiled. "For a presentation about Mars." "Naturally." Emily followed him into the kitchen. Mrs. Parker said my orbital transfer diagram was the most detailed she had ever seen. Daniel opened the refrigerator and removed ingredients for dinner. "That is because you worked hard." Emily shook her head. "That is because you helped me." Daniel laughed softly. "Same thing." 20 minutes later, they sat together at the small kitchen table eating spaghetti. The conversation moved easily between homework, science projects, and the stray cat Emily was convinced lived somewhere behind the building. To an outside observer, it would have looked ordinary. Yet these moments were the center of Daniel's world. Every extra shift, every unpaid bill, every sacrifice, it was all for her. After dinner came homework, then dishes, then their favorite ritual, science hour. Emily disappeared into her bedroom and returned carrying a stack of books nearly half her height. "Tonight?" Daniel asked. "Black holes." "Ambitious. You raised me this way." Daniel could not argue with that. They settled at the kitchen table. Outside, darkness slowly covered the city. Inside, diagrams and equations spread across the tabletop. Emily asked questions faster than most adults. Daniel answered them with patience and enthusiasm. Sometimes he simplified concepts. Sometimes he drew illustrations. Occasionally he admitted he did not know and promised they would learn together. Those were Emily's favorite moments. Nearly 2 hours passed before she finally yawned. That is enough science for one evening. Science never sleeps. Science is 10 years old and has school tomorrow. Emily laughed and gathered her books. Before heading to bed, she paused beside her father. "Can I ask something?" "Always." "Why do you work at that place?" Daniel looked up from the notebook he had been organizing. "Which place?" "The research center." "Because it pays the bills." Emily frowned slightly. "That is not the whole answer." Daniel smiled. She was becoming far too good at reading people. "No, then what is the whole answer?" He glanced toward the stack of aerospace journals sitting beside the couch. "I like being near things that inspire me." Emily considered that carefully. "You mean rockets?" "Among other things." "You miss it sometimes, do not you?" Daniel looked away for a moment. The question carried more weight than she realized. "Sometimes." Emily stepped closer. "You would have been really good at it." Daniel smiled gently. "Maybe. Not maybe." Her voice was firm. "Definitely." Daniel reached over and brushed a strand of hair away from her face. "Go get some sleep." "You changed the subject." "Yes. I noticed." "I know." Emily laughed and disappeared down the hallway. The apartment grew quiet. Minutes later, Daniel opened the worn notebook he always kept hidden from visitors. Page after page contained equations, propulsion models, orbital calculations, and engineering concepts developed over years. Some were unfinished. Others were remarkably detailed. He studied one page for several minutes before adding a few new notes. Outside, traffic moved through the distant streets. Inside, only the scratching sound of a pencil disturbed the silence. Few people knew these notebooks existed. Daniel preferred it that way. Recognition had never interested him. Understanding had. He continued working until nearly midnight. Then he closed the notebook and stared thoughtfully at the ceiling. Somewhere across the city, NASA engineers were still struggling with a problem they had not solved. Daniel did not know the details yet. He only knew that tomorrow would bring another day at the research center. Another day pushing a custodial cart through hallways filled with brilliant people. And another day where everyone would assume they already knew exactly who he was. The next morning began before sunrise. Daniel Brooks arrived at the research center while most of the city was still asleep. The parking lot sat nearly empty beneath a pale blue sky. Cold autumn air followed him as he unlocked a side entrance and stepped inside, carrying a thermos of coffee. The building felt different at this hour. Quieter, more honest. During the day, the hallways filled with conversations, presentations, deadlines, and opinions. Before dawn, only the hum of ventilation systems and distant machinery remained. Daniel preferred it that way. He pushed his custodial cart through the corridors with practiced efficiency. Trash bins were emptied. Floors were polished. Conference rooms were prepared for another long day of meetings. Nobody noticed him because almost nobody was there, and that suited him perfectly. Near 6 o'clock, he entered a large briefing room where the NASA delegation had met the previous day. Empty coffee cups still sat scattered across the table. Whiteboards were filled with equations, diagrams, and calculations. Daniel glanced at them briefly while replacing trash liners. Then he stopped. Something caught his attention. One section of the board contained a complex sequence of mathematical assumptions connected to a propulsion model. Daniel stared for a moment longer. Then another. His expression remained calm, but his eyes narrowed slightly. The numbers felt familiar. Not because he had seen them before, because he understood them. He slowly returned to his work. A few minutes later he left the room. Yet the equation stayed with him. By 7 o'clock the facility was coming alive. Employees arrived carrying coffee and laptops. Conversations echoed through hallways. Security checkpoints became active. The NASA team returned to the conference rooms. Daniel resumed cleaning common areas while quietly observing the growing tension inside the building. Something important was happening. Around mid-morning, he passed a glass-walled meeting room where several scientists appeared locked in a serious discussion. Charts filled large screens. Equations covered digital displays. One woman stood at the front of the room explaining something while others listened. Daniel recognized her from the previous day. Dr. Rebecca Hayes. NASA. She looked exhausted. So did everyone else. As Daniel pushed his cart past the room, he caught fragments of conversation through the partially open door. The model still breaks down. That assumption cannot be correct. We have checked it 3 times. Then check it 4. The discussion continued behind him as he moved away. Daniel said nothing. Yet curiosity lingered. Hours passed. During lunch, he sat alone once again near the cafeteria window. This time his notebook remained closed. Instead, he found himself thinking about the equations from the conference room. The more he considered them, the more convinced he became that something was wrong. Not with the math itself, with one assumption hidden inside it. A small error. The kind people overlooked when everyone became focused on larger problems. Across the cafeteria, several engineers laughed while discussing weekend plans. None of them noticed Daniel absent-mindedly sketching trajectories on a napkin. To them, he was simply the quiet custodian eating lunch alone. The afternoon brought more meetings, more discussions, more frustration. Around 3 o'clock, Daniel entered another conference room to refill supplies after a presentation ended. Employees had already left. Screens still displayed technical material. Papers covered the table. Daniel's eyes moved across the information automatically. Years of habit, years of curiosity, years of studying late at night after Emily had gone to bed. Then he saw it. The same assumption. Again. His heart skipped slightly. There it was. The tiny flaw connecting multiple calculations. The mistake was subtle enough to survive review after review. Yet once noticed, it became impossible to ignore. Daniel stood silently for several seconds. Then he looked away and resumed his work. He was a custodian. Nobody had asked his opinion. Nobody expected his opinion. Nobody wanted his opinion. That reality had been clear for a long time. By late afternoon, the building buzzed with increasing urgency. The NASA delegation remained on site. Senior management moved quickly between meetings. Engineers reviewed data repeatedly. Something was clearly behind schedule. Daniel finished cleaning a hallway near the primary conference suite just as another discussion ended. Rebecca Hayes emerged carrying a stack of documents. She looked frustrated. One engineer followed behind her. "What if we are solving the wrong problem?" he asked. Rebecca sighed. "Then we have spent 3 months solving the wrong problem." The statement lingered in Daniel's mind long after they disappeared around the corner. 3 months. He returned to work. Yet a strange feeling continued growing. Not pride. Not ambition. Responsibility. Because if he was correct, people were working incredibly hard to solve a problem that should not exist in the first place. As evening approached, employees gradually began leaving. The hallways emptied. The building quieted once more. Daniel finished his final assignments and pushed his cart toward the same conference room he had cleaned that morning. Through the glass wall, he could still see the equations covering the whiteboard. The room was empty now. Completely empty. For several seconds, Daniel simply stood there looking at the board. Then he took a slow breath. Tomorrow morning, NASA would still be searching for answers. And for the first time, Daniel began wondering whether remaining silent was really the right choice. The conference room remained silent except for the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. Daniel Brooks stood alone staring at the whiteboard. Equations stretched across its surface like pieces of a puzzle abandoned midway through completion. He looked toward the hallway. Empty. He looked back at the board. The flaw was still there. Small. Ordinary. Easy to miss. Yet every path seemed to circle back to it. Daniel tightened his grip on the handle of his custodial cart. For years he had trained himself to stay invisible. Invisible people avoided trouble. Invisible people kept their jobs. Invisible people focused on responsibilities rather than recognition. Most importantly, invisible people could provide stability for daughters who depended on them. He began pushing the cart toward the door. 3 steps later he stopped. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. Emily sitting at the kitchen table only weeks earlier. "If you know the answer, why would you pretend you do not?" she had asked while working through a difficult math problem. Daniel had smiled at the time. Now the question returned with surprising force. He looked at the whiteboard again. The room felt larger somehow. The silence heavier. Slowly, he walked back toward the board. Nearby sat a tray of dry erase markers left behind after the day's meetings. Daniel picked one up. For several seconds, he simply held it. Then he exhaled and began writing. His movements were calm and precise. No hesitation. No dramatic pause. Just line after line of mathematics flowing across an unused section of the board. He did not erase anyone's work. He did not criticize anyone's assumptions. He simply followed the logic where it naturally led. 1 equation became 2. 2 became 4. A revised variable appeared. Then a corrected trajectory. Then a different approach entirely. Daniel stepped back, studied it, made one final adjustment. The solution now occupied only a small portion of the massive whiteboard. Elegant, direct, quiet, much like the man who wrote it. He placed the marker down and looked at the clock. Nearly 7 o'clock. Most employees had already gone home. Daniel gave the board one final glance before pushing his cart from the room. Within minutes, he was outside beneath the cool evening sky heading toward his truck. He never expected anyone to notice. Across town, Emily sat at the kitchen table finishing homework when she heard keys jingling outside the apartment door. "You are early." Daniel stepped inside carrying groceries. "By 3 whole minutes. A new family record." He laughed. "I should have called the newspaper." Emily helped unload grocery bags. "How was work?" Daniel paused briefly. "Interesting." "Interesting good or interesting bad?" "Interesting unusual." Emily immediately became curious. "That means something happened." Daniel placed a carton of milk into the refrigerator. "Maybe. You were doing that thing again." "What thing?" "The thing where you pretend not to answer a question while technically answering it." Daniel laughed. "You inherited too much intelligence." "From you." "Debatable." Emily pointed toward him. "Not debatable." The conversation drifted toward dinner preparations and school assignments. Yet part of Daniel's mind remained back at the research center. Not because he expected praise. Quite the opposite. He suspected the equations would simply be erased by morning. Perhaps nobody would even notice them. That outcome seemed perfectly reasonable. Meanwhile, at the research facility, lights still glowed inside several conference rooms. The NASA team had remained late. Dr. Rebecca Hayes sat reviewing reports while fighting exhaustion. Around 8:30, She returned to the primary conference room carrying another stack of documents. 2 engineers followed behind her. "Tomorrow has to be different," one said. "We are running out of options." Rebecca nodded. "Then let us find one." They entered the room. One engineer stopped immediately. "Wait." Rebecca looked up. "What?" He pointed toward the whiteboard. All 3 stared. The additional equations stood out clearly against the existing work. Fresh marker. Fresh calculations. Fresh reasoning. Rebecca slowly approached the board. "Who wrote this?" Nobody answered. The room remained silent. She studied the equations carefully. Her expression changed, then changed again. No, one engineer stepped closer. "What is it?" Rebecca pointed to a specific line. "This assumption. What about it?" "We never questioned it." The engineer frowned. "Should we have?" Rebecca continued reading. Seconds passed, then a full minute. Finally, she set her documents onto the table. "Run these calculations." The engineer blinked. Now. Now." The room suddenly felt very awake. Computers opened. Data loaded. Numbers moved across screens. Outside the windows, darkness covered the city. Inside, something unexpected had begun. And somewhere at home, completely unaware of what was happening, Daniel Brooks sat beside his daughter, helping her solve a middle school science problem, while an entirely different room of experts started following the trail he had quietly left behind. The next morning began with confusion. Not panic, not celebration. Confusion. Rebecca Hayes stood in front of the whiteboard while a group of engineers reviewed results that should not have existed. Screens across the room displayed updated simulations. Trajectories aligned. Error margins shrank. Calculations that had resisted months of effort suddenly fit together with remarkable precision. One engineer leaned back in his chair. "Run it again." Another. "Already had." Same result. Again. The numbers remained unchanged. Rebecca crossed her arms and studied the equations on the board. The solution was not just correct. That was what bothered her. It was elegant. The kind of elegant solution experts rarely found because expertise often encouraged complexity. Whoever had written those equations understood the problem deeply enough to simplify it. That level of understanding was uncommon. "Who had access to this room last night?" Rebecca asked. A facilities manager reviewed a digital log. Several cleaning staff. Security personnel. A few engineers. Find out exactly who. Meanwhile, Daniel Brooks arrived through the side entrance carrying his thermos and lunch bag. The morning felt ordinary. He greeted the security guard, collected his custodial supplies, checked his assignments. Nothing suggested that an entire group of aerospace professionals was currently discussing his handwriting. Daniel pushed his cart down the main corridor as employees hurried past. Most ignored him. A few nodded politely. One of the younger engineers from earlier in the week passed by carrying a laptop. "Morning, Daniel." "Morning. Big day." Daniel smiled. "Every day seems big around here lately." The engineer laughed and continued walking. Daniel resumed work. Inside the conference suite, conversations intensified. Rebecca examined security records while reviewing additional data. "The corrected assumption changes everything," one analyst explained. "Fuel efficiency projections improve significantly." Another scientist nodded. "The model becomes stable." Rebecca looked toward the whiteboard again. "That is not what interests me." "What does?" "The person who found it." Silence followed. Everyone understood why. Hundreds of talented professionals had examined the problem. Hundreds. Yet the breakthrough had appeared overnight from an unknown source. That fact demanded an explanation. Across the building, Daniel entered a quiet office area to empty trash bins. As he worked, his thoughts drifted toward Emily's upcoming science fair project. She wanted to build a scale model demonstrating orbital transfers using magnets and marbles. Daniel was already considering improvements. He smiled to himself. Emily would probably improve the design before he did. Around mid-morning, Rebecca requested access to security footage. Several employees gathered around a monitor. Timestamps moved across the screen. Conference room. Hallway. Conference room again. Engineers entering. Engineers leaving. Cleaning crews arriving. The footage continued. Then someone pointed. "Stop." The image froze. Rebecca stared. A custodian stood alone inside the conference room. He was looking at the whiteboard. Zoom in. The image enlarged. The resolution was imperfect but clear enough. The man picked up a marker. Several people exchanged confused glances. Rebecca watched silently as the recording played forward. The custodian wrote for several minutes. Then he placed the marker down and left. Nobody spoke. Finally, one engineer broke the silence. That is impossible. Another leaned closer to the screen. Who is he? The facilities manager checked a roster. Daniel Brooks. What department? Custodial services. The room became very quiet. Rebecca continued watching the footage. Daniel showed no hesitation, no uncertainty, no sign of guessing. He wrote exactly the way experts wrote when they already knew the answer. I want his file, Rebecca said. Immediately. At nearly the same moment, Daniel was helping an elderly employee carry several boxes between offices. I appreciate this, the employee said. Happy to help. You always seem happy. Daniel laughed softly. Not always. You hide it well. Years of practice. The employee smiled and continued on his way. Daniel returned to work without realizing his name was now circulating through conference rooms occupied by NASA personnel. By lunchtime, curiosity had spread throughout the research center. Not publicly, quietly. Managers whispered. Engineers exchanged theories. Some assumed Daniel must have copied the equations from somewhere. Others suspected the footage was misleading. A few simply refused to believe it. Rebecca believed the evidence. But evidence created new questions. She spent part of the afternoon reviewing publicly available information. There was almost nothing unusual. High school records, employment history, custodial work, no advanced engineering position, no aerospace career, no obvious explanation. Yet the equations remained on the board. Real equations, correct equations, brilliant equations. Late in the afternoon, Rebecca walked past a cafeteria window and noticed a familiar figure sitting alone with a notebook. Daniel Brooks. He appeared completely unaware of the attention surrounding him. He was eating a sandwich while reading something handwritten. Ordinary, calm, invisible. Rebecca stopped walking. Through the glass, she watched him turn a page filled with mathematical notes. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Then Daniel closed the notebook and stood up. For the first time since arriving at the facility, Rebecca Hayes felt certain about one thing. The breakthrough had not come from a mystery. It had come from a man everyone had already seen and nobody had truly noticed. Rebecca Hayes did not approach Daniel immediately. Experience had taught her that assumptions were dangerous. The entire situation already seemed improbable enough. A NASA team had spent months examining a problem. A breakthrough appeared overnight. Security footage pointed to a custodian. Logic suggested caution. Yet every calculation continued leading back to the same conclusion. Later that afternoon, Rebecca requested access to Daniel's employment records again. Nothing changed. No advanced engineering positions. No aerospace research appointments. No public academic career. Just years of ordinary work history. The more she searched, the stranger it became. One senior engineer leaned back in his chair. Maybe he copied it. Rebecca shook her head. From where? Nobody answered. Maybe he got lucky. Nobody gets lucky with 6 pages of correct mathematical reasoning. Silence returned. Across the building, Daniel continued his responsibilities completely unaware of the discussion. He cleaned a training room, refilled supplies in a break area, helped a receptionist move several boxes of archived files. His day followed the same rhythm it always had. Quiet work, small conversations, little recognition. At one point he passed a group of engineers discussing the latest developments. The person who solved it has to be some kind of genius. One of them laughed. Probably a retired professor. Daniel smiled politely as he pushed his cart past them. The irony almost made him laugh. Meanwhile, Rebecca reviewed the security footage again. Something about Daniel's body language stood out. There was no hesitation, no trial and error. He had approached the board already knowing where he was going. She had seen that confidence before. It belonged to people who truly understood their subject, not people pretending to understand it. Near the end of the workday, Rebecca made a decision. I want to speak with him. One engineer blinked. Directly? Yes. What are you going to ask? Rebecca looked toward the equations still covering the board. The truth. Several floors away, Daniel was finishing his final assignment when a facilities supervisor approached. Daniel. Yes. Someone is looking for you. Daniel stopped polishing a section of floor. Me? That is what I said. Who? The supervisor glanced at a message on his phone. Dr. Rebecca Hayes. Daniel immediately recognized the name. NASA. Last time I checked. Daniel felt a brief moment of surprise. Did she say why? No, the supervisor smiled. Whatever it is, try not to get us all fired. Daniel laughed softly. I will do my best. A few minutes later, he arrived outside a conference room overlooking the western side of the facility. Evening sunlight streamed through enormous windows, painting the room with warm shades of gold and orange. Rebecca stood near the table reviewing documents. She looked up as he entered. Mr. Brooks, Daniel is fine. Thank you for meeting with me. Of course. Rebecca gestured toward a chair. Please sit. Daniel sat calmly. Years earlier, the situation might have made him nervous. Now he simply felt curious. Rebecca studied him for a moment. How long have you worked here? Almost 7 years. Do you enjoy it? Daniel smiled. Most days. Most. Every job has difficult days. Rebecca nodded. Fair answer. A brief silence followed. Then she slid a photograph across the table. It showed the whiteboard. More specifically, it showed the equations Daniel had written. He looked at it and immediately understood. You found them. Rebecca watched carefully. So you admit you wrote them? Daniel considered the question. Yes. No hesitation. No denial. Just honesty. Rebecca felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and disbelief. Why? Daniel glanced toward the photograph. Because the assumption was wrong. You recognized that immediately? Not immediately. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. How long? A few minutes. For the first time, she laughed. Not mockingly. Simply because the answer sounded almost absurd. A few minutes? Approximately. Rebecca leaned forward. Daniel, our team has examined that model for months. I know. You know? People were discussing it. And you understood what they were discussing? Daniel remained quiet for a moment. Most of it. The room grew still. Outside, the sun continued sinking toward the horizon. Rebecca folded her hands. Who are you? Daniel smiled slightly. It was not the smile of someone hiding a secret. It was the smile of someone who had spent years being misunderstood. Just a father trying to pay bills. Rebecca looked unconvinced. That is not the whole answer. Daniel glanced toward the window where fading sunlight illuminated the city skyline. Then he looked back at her. No, he said softly. It is not. And for the first time since arriving at the research center, Rebecca Hayes realized she was no longer investigating a mathematical breakthrough. She was uncovering a story nobody in the building had ever bothered to ask about. Rebecca Hayes remained seated for several seconds after Daniel left the conference room. The conversation had answered one question and created 10 more. Through years of research, leadership, and problem-solving, she had learned to recognize intelligence. Genuine intelligence carried a certain quiet confidence. It did not demand attention. It did not advertise itself. Daniel Brooks possessed that quality in abundance. Meanwhile, Daniel walked through the nearly empty parking lot toward his truck. The sky had darkened into deep shades of blue. Lights from the research center reflected across the pavement. He paused briefly before opening the driver's door. For a moment, he simply stood there. Not because he was excited. Not because he was afraid. Because he knew something had changed. He could feel it. The comfortable invisibility that had defined his life for years was beginning to disappear. Across town, Emily sat at the kitchen table surrounded by books and colored markers. A half-finished science fair display occupied most of the available space. The moment Daniel entered the apartment, she looked up. You are thinking. Daniel smiled. Am I? Yes. How can you tell? Because you forgot to take off your jacket. Daniel looked down. She was right. That is concerning. Emily pointed dramatically. Evidence. He laughed and finally removed the jacket. You should become a detective. Too easy. Astronaut. Maybe. Scientist. Probably. President. Emily considered the possibility. Only if necessary. Their laughter filled the apartment. For a few minutes, the weight of the day faded. Dinner followed. Homework followed dinner. Then came their usual science discussion. Yet tonight Daniel found himself distracted. Emily noticed immediately. Something happened. Daniel sighed. You really should become a detective. I already solved the case. Did you? Someone important talked to you. Daniel raised an eyebrow. How do you know that? Because when regular people talk to you, you forget about it. When important people talk to you, you think about it afterward. Daniel stared at her for a second. That is alarmingly accurate. Emily grinned. I know. Back at the research center, Rebecca sat with several members of the NASA team reviewing additional material. The breakthrough solution continued producing extraordinary results. Every verification strengthened its credibility. Every test confirmed the same conclusion. One senior analyst leaned forward. "What are we going to do?" Rebecca glanced toward the whiteboard. "We are going to learn more." "About the equations?" "About Daniel." Another engineer looked skeptical. "Maybe he just studied on his own." Rebecca nodded. "Maybe." "You do not sound convinced." Rebecca folded her arms. "Neither do you." Silence followed. Everyone in the room understood the same thing. Daniel's explanation felt incomplete. Honest, but incomplete. The next morning, whispers moved through the facility before Daniel even arrived. News traveled quickly in professional environments, especially unusual news. Several employees had already heard rumors involving NASA, security footage, and a custodian with an unexpected talent for advanced mathematics. Most dismissed the stories. Others exaggerated them. A few became intensely curious. Daniel remained unaware. He entered through the side door, carrying his thermos as always. The security guard greeted him differently this time. "Morning, Daniel." "Morning. Big celebrity now?" Daniel stopped. "What?" The guard laughed. "Never mind." Daniel continued walking, slightly confused. By 8 o'clock, the atmosphere felt noticeably different. People who normally ignored him now glanced in his direction. Some nodded. Others seemed uncertain whether to speak. Daniel focused on work. That was what he always did. Yet the attention kept growing. Around mid-morning, he entered a break room to refill supplies. Two engineers stopped talking the moment he walked in. The silence lasted only a second. But Daniel noticed. He always noticed. One of them finally spoke. "Morning, Daniel." "Morning. Heard you had an interesting meeting yesterday." Daniel smiled politely. "Perhaps." The engineer looked disappointed by the lack of details. Daniel returned to work. Across the facility, Rebecca reached a decision. Waiting no longer made sense. Questions required answers. Shortly before lunch, she sent a formal request through internal administration. By noon, conference room reservations had been updated. Several senior researchers had been notified. A private technical review session had been scheduled for the following day. The invitation list included some of the brightest minds in the building. It also included one name that immediately surprised everyone who saw it. Daniel Brooks. Custodial Services. When the notification appeared in employee systems, conversation stopped, then started again even louder. Nobody understood why NASA wanted a custodian in a technical review meeting. Nobody except Rebecca Hayes, because she had reached a conclusion the others had not yet accepted. The breakthrough was not the story. Daniel Brooks was. Daniel discovered the meeting invitation just before the end of his shift. He had been restocking supplies in a storage room when his supervisor appeared holding a printed schedule. "You might want to look at this." Daniel wiped his hands on a cloth and accepted the paper. His eyes moved down the page. Technical review session. NASA personnel. Senior research staff. Executive management. Then he found his own name. Daniel Brooks. Custodial Services. For several seconds he simply stared. This is a mistake. His supervisor shook his head. Apparently not. There has to be another Daniel Brooks. There is not. Daniel looked at the schedule again. Why am I invited? If I knew that, I would probably have a much better office. Daniel laughed softly despite himself. Yet as he folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket, a familiar feeling returned. Not fear. Responsibility. The same feeling he had experienced before writing on the whiteboard. Meanwhile, the invitation was generating reactions throughout the facility. In conference rooms and hallways, employees discussed little else. "A custodian?" one engineer asked. "There has to be more to the story." Another shook his head. "Maybe NASA is making some kind of point." A third leaned back in his chair. "Or maybe the rumors are true." Nobody seemed completely certain what to believe. The following morning arrived cold and bright. Sunlight reflected off the glass exterior of the research center as employees filed into the building. Daniel arrived as usual carrying coffee and lunch. Yet nothing felt usual anymore. He noticed conversations stopping when he approached. He noticed curious glances. He noticed whispers. Most of all, he noticed how uncomfortable attention made him feel. At 10 o'clock, he stood outside the conference room listed on the invitation. Through the glass walls, he could see senior researchers already seated around a large table. Rebecca Hayes stood near the front reviewing presentation materials. Several executives occupied seats along one side of the room. Daniel adjusted the collar of his work shirt. Then he entered. Conversations immediately softened. Not because anyone intended to be rude, because everyone wanted to see what happened next. Rebecca looked up and smiled. "Good morning, Daniel." "Good morning. Please have a seat." Daniel glanced around the room. Every chair appeared occupied by scientists, engineers, analysts, or executives. He felt distinctly out of place. Yet Rebecca's expression remained calm and welcoming. Slowly, he took an empty seat near the end of the table. The meeting began. For the first 30 minutes, technical discussions dominated the conversation. Updated simulations appeared on large screens. Charts filled displays. Data projections covered multiple monitors. Daniel listened quietly. He recognized nearly every concept being discussed. He simply had no reason to interrupt. Eventually, Rebecca turned toward him. "Daniel." Every head in the room followed. "Yes. I would like your opinion." Several people exchanged glances. Daniel remained calm. "About what specifically?" Rebecca smiled slightly. "That is a very scientist-like answer." A few people laughed. Rebecca changed the display on the screen. A complex model appeared. "This." Daniel studied it. Silence settled across the room. 1 minute passed. Then another. Nobody moved. Finally, Daniel leaned forward slightly. "The model assumes constant thermal variation after orbital insertion." Rebecca nodded. "Correct. I would not." Several researchers immediately began taking notes. Rebecca looked interested. "Why?" Daniel stood and walked toward the screen. The room remained perfectly quiet. He pointed to a specific section of data. "Because this variable depends on conditions that are changing here." He moved his finger slightly lower. "And because this adjustment is compensating for an earlier assumption rather than solving the underlying issue." One engineer frowned. "You saw that immediately?" Daniel considered the question. "Not immediately." A few smiles appeared. Rebecca recognized the same answer from their previous conversation. Daniel continued explaining. His voice remained calm. There was no arrogance, no attempt to impress anyone. He spoke exactly the way he explained science concepts to Emily. Simple language, clear reasoning, step by step. Gradually the room changed. Skepticism faded. Curiosity replaced it. Then curiosity gave way to something else. Respect. Several participants stopped looking at Daniel as a custodian and started looking at him the way professionals look at another expert. Rebecca noticed the shift happening in real time. By the end of the discussion, nobody seemed interested in his job title anymore. They cared only about his ideas. As the meeting concluded, people remained seated longer than expected. Nobody rushed toward the door. Nobody checked phones. The atmosphere felt different now. Quieter. Thoughtful. One senior engineer who had laughed at Daniel earlier in the week approached him near the exit. "I owe you an apology." Daniel looked surprised. "For what?" "For making assumptions." Daniel smiled gently. "Most people do." The engineer nodded. "Still." Daniel extended his hand. "Then let us both move forward." The engineer shook it. Across the room, Rebecca watched the exchange. She had come searching for the person who solved a difficult problem. What she had found was something far rarer. A man whose intelligence was impressive enough to command attention and whose character was strong enough to never seek it. By the time Daniel left the meeting, the building no longer felt quite the same. The hallways were identical. The offices had not moved. The polished floors still reflected the overhead lights. Yet something invisible had shifted. People were beginning to see him differently. Daniel was not entirely sure how he felt about that. As he pushed his custodial cart toward a storage room, several employees greeted him by name. A week earlier, many of them would have walked past without noticing him. Now they smiled. Some asked questions. Others simply nodded with newfound respect. Daniel responded the same way he always had. Calmly, politely, without drawing attention to himself. That afternoon, Rebecca Hayes sat reviewing notes from the technical session. What impressed her most was not Daniel's knowledge. It was the way he communicated it. Many brilliant people complicated ideas. Daniel simplified them. Many experts wanted recognition. Daniel seemed almost uncomfortable receiving it. The contrast fascinated her. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. One of the senior analysts entered carrying a folder. "You should see this." Rebecca opened the folder and immediately recognized the contents. Employment records. Archived educational records. Additional background information. Information that had been difficult to locate because it was old. Very old. Her eyes moved across the pages. Then she stopped. "Well," she said quietly. The analyst smiled. "Exactly. Years earlier, Daniel Brooks had attended one of the most respected engineering programs in the country. His academic performance had been extraordinary. Research professors had praised him. Scholarships had followed. Graduate opportunities had appeared. The future had looked remarkably bright. Then the record changed. Suddenly, abruptly, academic progress stopped. Research disappeared. Professional opportunities vanished. Several years contained almost no public information at all. Rebecca continued reading. The analyst finally spoke. Looks like he left before finishing the path everyone expected. Rebecca nodded slowly. People do not usually walk away from opportunities like these. No, unless something more important appears. Across town, Daniel arrived home carrying groceries. Emily opened the door before he reached it. You are famous. Daniel laughed immediately. That is unlikely. Mrs. Parker called. My fourth-grade teacher? My teacher. Right. Emily folded her arms. She heard about the meeting. Daniel looked surprised. How? Adults talk more than children. Daniel considered that statement. You may be right. Emily smiled proudly. I know. During dinner, she continued asking questions. What happened? We talked. About rockets. Among other things. Did you solve problems? A few. Emily leaned forward. Did they know you could do that? Daniel paused. Not all of them. Do they know now? He smiled. Some of them do. Emily seemed satisfied with that answer. Later that evening, after homework was finished and dishes were cleaned, Daniel sat alone at the kitchen table. His notebook lay open before him, yet he was not writing. Instead, he stared thoughtfully through the window. Memories had begun returning. University classrooms, research labs, long nights studying difficult concepts simply because he loved learning. Back then, the future had seemed straightforward. Then life had changed. Responsibilities had changed. Priorities had changed. He had never regretted choosing family. Not once. Yet he had spent years quietly placing parts of himself aside. Not abandoning them. Simply setting them down. A gentle voice interrupted his thoughts. You miss it sometimes. Daniel looked up. Emily stood in the hallway holding a blanket. I thought you were asleep. I was trying. Daniel smiled. And you were thinking too loudly. He laughed softly. Emily crossed the room and sat beside him. You miss it. Daniel considered the question carefully. Sometimes. Do you wish things had been different? The question lingered between them. Finally, Daniel shook his head. No, Emily looked surprised. Really? Really? Why? Daniel closed the notebook. Because if everything had gone according to plan, I might not be sitting here talking to you. Emily smiled. That is a good answer. It is also true. She rested her head against his shoulder. Outside, autumn wind brushed against the apartment windows. Inside, the room felt warm and quiet. Back at the research center, Rebecca remained in her office long after most employees had gone home. One document still rested on her desk. Daniel's academic record. She glanced at it once more before looking toward the darkened city skyline beyond her window. The breakthrough equations finally made sense. The technical expertise made sense. The confidence made sense. Yet one mystery remained. Why had a man with that level of ability chosen to disappear into the background for so many years? Rebecca suspected she already knew the answer. The answer was not ambition. It was not failure. It was not disappointment. The answer had a name. Emily Brooks. And for the first time, Rebecca realized that the most impressive thing about Daniel might not be the intelligence everyone had just discovered. It might be the sacrifices nobody had ever seen. The following week brought something Daniel Brooks had never wanted and never expected. Attention. It appeared in small ways at first. Employees greeted him more often. Managers stopped to ask questions. Engineers invited him into conversations that would have been unthinkable only days earlier. Daniel remained polite, but the sudden change left him uneasy. For years he had built a life around quiet dignity. Recognition felt strangely loud. On Tuesday morning, he arrived at the research center and discovered 3 separate messages waiting for him. One came from a department manager asking for input on a technical discussion. Another came from a research analyst requesting a meeting. The third came from Rebecca Hayes. Daniel stared at the messages for a moment before smiling to himself. A month earlier, nobody would have asked for his opinion about anything beyond floor maintenance schedules. He placed the messages aside and began his normal workday. Across the facility, however, the atmosphere continued evolving. The technical solution Daniel had contributed was now producing measurable improvements in ongoing project evaluations. Engineers who had initially doubted him were becoming some of his strongest supporters. Not because they felt embarrassed, because evidence was impossible to ignore. During a morning review session, one senior scientist pointed toward an updated model. His adjustment improved the entire framework. Another nodded. We were approaching the problem from the wrong direction. Rebecca listened quietly. The conversation no longer surprised her. What surprised her was how quickly people had adapted once their assumptions were challenged. Human beings often resisted changing their minds. Yet the best scientists learned to follow evidence rather than ego. That principle was slowly reshaping the culture around Daniel. Later that afternoon, Rebecca found him cleaning a conference room. Do you have a minute? Daniel looked up from a table he was wiping down. Of course. Walk with me. They moved through a quiet hallway lined with windows overlooking the facility grounds. Autumn sunlight painted long shadows across the floor. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Rebecca finally broke the silence. I reviewed more of your background. Daniel smiled faintly. That sounds dangerous. Rebecca laughed. You attended one of the best engineering programs in the country. A long time ago. Your professors described you as exceptional. Daniel looked out the window. They were kind. Daniel. Rebecca stopped walking. Why did you leave? The question hung in the air. Daniel had expected it eventually. He simply had not expected it to feel so personal. For several seconds, he remained silent. Then he answered. Emily was 3 years old. Rebecca listened. Her mother passed away unexpectedly. Daniel's voice remained calm. Years had softened the pain, but never erased it. Everything changed very quickly. Rebecca's expression softened. I am sorry. Daniel nodded gratefully. At the time, I had a choice. Continue chasing opportunities that required constant travel and uncertainty, or create stability for my daughter. So you chose stability. I chose her. The hallway became quiet again. Outside, leaves drifted across the facility grounds. Rebecca looked at him differently now. Not with admiration for his intelligence. With respect for his priorities. Do you regret it? She asked. Daniel answered immediately. Never. There was no hesitation. No trace of doubt. Rebecca believed him completely. That evening, Daniel returned home carrying groceries and a small science magazine he had purchased for Emily. He found her sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by project materials. Emergency, she announced. How serious? Extremely serious. Daniel set the groceries down. Should I call NASA? Emily pointed toward a collection of cardboard pieces. The launch platform collapsed. Daniel examined the scene. This is devastating. I know. Can it be repaired? That depends. On what? Emily smiled. Whether the engineer helping me knows what he is doing. Daniel laughed. Together they spent the next hour rebuilding the project. Tape, cardboard, markers, and imagination transformed the kitchen table into a miniature aerospace laboratory. The work itself was simple. The moment was not. As Daniel watched Emily explain her ideas with growing confidence, he felt something deeper than pride. He felt gratitude. Every sacrifice suddenly seemed small compared to this. Later, after Emily went to bed, Daniel sat alone by the window. His notebook rested nearby. Yet tonight he did not open it. Instead, he reflected on how dramatically life had changed in only a few days. People were beginning to recognize abilities he had hidden for years. Opportunities might follow. Conversations might become more complicated. The future felt uncertain in ways it had not felt for a long time. Yet one thing remained unchanged. Down the hallway, a 10-year-old girl slept peacefully knowing her father would be there in the morning. Daniel smiled softly. The world might finally be discovering who he was. But the person whose opinion mattered most had known all along. The invitation arrived on a Thursday afternoon. Unlike the previous meeting, this one did not come through internal scheduling systems. It came directly from NASA. Daniel stared at the email for several seconds before reading it again. Then a third time. The wording was professional and straightforward. Rebecca Hayes and several senior program leaders wished to discuss future collaboration opportunities. Daniel leaned back in his chair inside a quiet maintenance office. For years, opportunities had been things he watched happen to other people. Now one was sitting in his inbox. Across the facility, news spread quickly. Not because anyone leaked confidential information. Because people had eyes. Rebecca meeting with Daniel had become normal. NASA personnel seeking his input had become normal. The impossible had slowly transformed into routine. Yet this invitation felt different. It suggested something larger, something permanent. That evening, Daniel arrived home carrying the weight of the decision with him. Emily immediately noticed. "You are thinking loudly again." Daniel laughed. "I thought we discussed this. And yet you keep doing it." She pointed toward the kitchen table. "Sit. Is this an intervention?" "Possibly." Daniel sat down. Emily climbed into the chair across from him. "Tell me." Daniel considered how to explain it. "Someone offered me an opportunity." "Good opportunity or scary opportunity?" "Both." Emily nodded seriously. "Those are usually the important ones." Daniel smiled. Sometimes he forgot she was only 10 years old. "NASA wants to discuss future work." Emily blinked once, then twice. NASA. "I believe there is only one." For a moment, she looked completely speechless. Then she jumped from her chair and nearly knocked over a pencil holder. "You are joking." "I am not." Emily laughed so hard she had to sit back down. "Dad." "Yes." "That is amazing." Daniel looked at the table. "Maybe." Emily immediately pointed at him. "That is not a maybe. There are complications. There are always complications." Daniel could not argue with that. Later that night, after Emily went to bed, he sat quietly beside the apartment window. The city lights shimmered in the distance. His reflection stared back from the glass. For years he had convinced himself that certain chapters of his life were finished. Not because he lacked ability, because responsibility had required different priorities. Yet now those chapters seemed to be opening again. The following morning, Daniel entered the research center and found Rebecca waiting near the conference suite. "Good morning." "Morning. Did you receive the invitation?" Daniel nodded. "I did." Rebecca studied him carefully. "And I have not decided anything." "Fair." They began walking through the hallway together. Employees greeted them as they passed. Several weeks earlier, such a sight would have seemed impossible. Now nobody thought much about it. Rebecca finally broke the silence. "Can I tell you something?" "Of course." "When I first saw the security footage, I thought I was looking for a hidden genius." Daniel smiled faintly. "And I was wrong." Daniel looked amused. "That is disappointing." Rebecca laughed. "What I found was something much rarer." "Which is?" She stopped walking. "Someone who never allowed intelligence to become more important than character." Daniel looked away briefly. Compliments still made him uncomfortable. Rebecca continued. "Do not underestimate how unusual that is." Before Daniel could answer, a voice interrupted from behind. "Excuse me." They turned. A senior executive approached carrying a folder. The same executive who had barely acknowledged Daniel's existence a month earlier. "Daniel." "Yes." The executive extended his hand. "I never properly thanked you." Daniel shook it. "For what?" "For helping save a project that many people had nearly given up on." Daniel smiled politely. "A lot of people contributed." "Maybe." The executive shook his head. "But somebody had to notice what everyone else missed." As the man walked away, Rebecca smiled. "You are getting used to this yet?" Daniel answered honestly. "Not even slightly." That afternoon, another surprise arrived. Emily's school science fair. Parents were invited. Daniel had promised to attend weeks ago. Normally, the event would have been simple. But now NASA meetings, executive schedules, and technical reviews threatened to create conflicts. For the first time, Daniel faced a decision that felt strangely familiar. Opportunity on one side, Emily on the other. The answer came instantly. It always did. The science fair won. 2 days later, the school gymnasium buzzed with excited students and proud families. Folding tables filled the room. Posters covered every wall. Emily stood beside her orbital transfer project wearing a huge smile. Daniel arrived carrying flowers and a camera. The moment she spotted him, her face lit up. "You came." Daniel looked genuinely surprised. "I said I would." Emily smiled. "I know." Across the room, parents discussed projects and teachers evaluated presentations. Nothing about the evening seemed extraordinary. Yet as Daniel watched his daughter confidently explain scientific concepts to judges twice her age, he felt something profound. Success was not always measured by titles, awards, or prestigious invitations. Sometimes success stood beside a cardboard model in a school gymnasium and smiled because her father had kept his promise. And at that exact moment, Daniel Brooks realized that whatever decision he made about the future, he already possessed the achievement that mattered most. The Monday meeting with NASA finally arrived. Daniel Brooks woke before sunrise, though not because of nerves. Years of responsibility had trained him to greet the day early. He prepared breakfast, packed Emily's lunch, and made sure her science fair ribbon occupied its new place of honor on the apartment wall. Emily noticed him looking at it. "You are proud." Daniel smiled. "Very. Good." She grabbed her backpack. "You should be. And you should hurry, or the school bus will leave without you." Emily laughed. Before heading out the door, she paused. "You are going to do great today." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You do not even know what is happening today." "Does not matter." She smiled confidently. "You are still going to do great." Then she disappeared into the hallway. Daniel stood quietly for a moment after the door closed. Sometimes he wondered whether he was teaching Emily or whether she was teaching him. At the research center, the atmosphere felt unusually focused. Several NASA representatives had returned. Senior executives occupied conference rooms. Engineers reviewed final reports. Whatever happened during today's meeting would influence future decisions. Daniel arrived wearing the same simple work clothes he always wore. That fact alone seemed to surprise people. One manager approached him in the hallway. "You know this is an important meeting, right?" Daniel smiled. "I have heard rumors." The manager glanced at the work shirt. "You could have dressed differently." Daniel looked down at the uniform. "This one still fits." The manager laughed despite himself. Daniel continued toward the conference suite. Inside the largest conference room in the building, nearly 24 people had already gathered. NASA officials, senior researchers, executive leadership, technical specialists. Rebecca Hayes stood near the front reviewing final notes. When Daniel entered, conversations gradually quieted. Rebecca smiled. "Glad you made it." Traffic was terrible. Several people laughed. The tension eased immediately. Daniel took a seat. Unlike previous meetings, nobody seemed surprised he was there. That realization alone represented a remarkable change. The session began with project updates. Data projections appeared on enormous screens. Technical achievements were reviewed. Progress resulting from Daniel's contribution became impossible to ignore. Multiple teams reported improvements. Simulations performed beyond expectations. Several months of uncertainty had transformed into momentum. Finally, one senior NASA administrator stood. "Before we discuss future planning," he said, "there is something we would like to address." The room became quiet. The administrator looked directly toward Daniel. "A few weeks ago, most of us had never heard your name." Daniel smiled politely. "That was true for me too." Soft laughter moved through the room. The administrator continued. "Since then, we have learned quite a bit." He gestured toward a screen. A photograph appeared. Not of equations. Not of technical models. A photograph of Daniel standing beside a much younger Emily years earlier. Daniel looked surprised. Rebecca smiled. "We did some research." Additional photographs followed. Academic achievements. Research projects. University records. Scholarship recognitions. A remarkable history hidden beneath years of quiet work. Nobody in the room spoke. The administrator finally addressed the audience. What impressed us was not his intelligence. Intelligence is common in rooms like this. Several heads nodded. What impressed us was what he chose to do with his life. Silence settled across the conference room. The administrator continued. Many talented people pursue recognition. Many pursue titles. Many pursue prestige. Daniel pursued responsibility. Rebecca glanced toward him. Daniel looked slightly uncomfortable. Praise still felt unfamiliar. Then came the moment nobody expected. The administrator reached into a folder and removed a document. "We would like to formally offer you a consulting position with our team." The room remained silent. Completely silent. Not because anyone opposed the idea. Because everyone understood the significance. Daniel stared at the document. For years he had worked quietly in the background. For years nobody had asked what he knew. Now one of the most respected organizations in the world was inviting him to contribute directly. Rebecca watched carefully. She knew the room expected an immediate answer. She also knew Daniel better than that. Daniel looked at the offer. Then he looked around the room. Finally he spoke. "May I ask a question?" The administrator nodded. "Of course. Will I still have time to attend science fairs?" For a second nobody reacted. Then several people smiled. Rebecca laughed softly. The administrator looked genuinely confused. "Science fairs." Daniel nodded. "My daughter has more important projects than I do." The room erupted with warm laughter. Yet beneath the humor sat something powerful. Daniel was not joking. The administrator recognized that immediately. After a moment, he smiled. Yes, Daniel. His voice carried genuine respect. You will absolutely have time to attend science fairs. The meeting continued. Discussions followed. Details remained to be negotiated. Yet something extraordinary had already happened. Not because a job offer had been presented. Not because a hidden genius had finally been recognized. The extraordinary moment was simpler than that. An entire room filled with accomplished people had discovered that the strongest measure of success was not intelligence, prestige, or achievement. It was character. And in that room, Daniel Brooks possessed more of it than anyone. 3 months later, life looked different. Not completely different. Daniel Brooks still woke before sunrise. He still made breakfast. He still packed lunches. He still reminded Emily not to leave homework on the kitchen table. Some things never changed, and those were the things he treasured most. Yet other parts of life had evolved in ways neither of them could have imagined. The consulting arrangement with NASA had become official. Daniel contributed to research discussions several days each month while maintaining a schedule that allowed him to remain present for the moments that mattered most. The arrangement surprised many people. Several executives had expected him to pursue larger titles. Others assumed he would chase prestige now that recognition had finally arrived. Daniel chose balance instead. He always had. On a bright spring morning, he stood beside a large conference room window reviewing technical notes when Rebecca Hayes entered carrying 2 cups of coffee. You know, she said, handing him one. People still talk about the whiteboard. Daniel smiled. I was afraid of that. You should not be. Rebecca leaned against the window. That moment changed more than a project. Daniel looked outside. Engineers crossed the campus below. Students toured part of the facility. Employees hurried between buildings. How so? Rebecca laughed softly. People question assumptions more often now. Daniel nodded. That seems useful. Very. Rebecca studied him for a moment. Do you ever think about how differently this could have gone? Daniel considered the question. Not really. Why not? He smiled. Because it went the way it was supposed to. Rebecca shook her head with amusement. After all these months, she still found his perspective remarkable. Across town, Emily stood in front of her class delivering a presentation about future space exploration. Her confidence had grown tremendously. She spoke clearly. She answered questions thoughtfully. She smiled often. When classmates asked how she knew so much about science, her answer never changed. My dad taught me. To her, that explanation seemed completely ordinary. The truth was that it was extraordinary. Later that afternoon, Daniel arrived at the school just in time to watch the final presentations. He sat quietly in the back row beside other parents. Most of them knew parts of his story by now. News articles had appeared. Interviews had been requested. Recognition had followed. Daniel politely declined most of it. Fame had never interested him. Emily stepped onto the stage for her closing remarks. The room became quiet. People think the smartest person in a room is always the loudest, she said. But that is not true. Daniel felt a smile forming before she even continued. Sometimes the smartest person is helping someone else shine. Several parents nodded. A few teachers exchanged knowing glances. Emily looked toward the audience. Then she found her father sitting near the back. My dad taught me that. The room erupted into applause. Daniel immediately looked uncomfortable. Emily immediately looked proud. After the event ended, families filled the hallways. Students celebrated. Teachers congratulated one another. Through all the activity, one moment stood apart. Emily ran toward Daniel carrying her project materials. Did you hear that speech? She asked. Daniel laughed. I may have. It was good. Very humble, too. Emily grinned. I learned from the best. As they walked toward the parking lot, spring sunlight illuminated the campus. The air felt warm. Trees swayed gently in the breeze. Around them, ordinary life continued. Cars started. Doors closed. Conversations drifted through the afternoon air. Yet for Daniel, the moment felt unusually meaningful. Not because of awards. Not because of recognition. Not because NASA had asked him questions nobody expected a custodian to answer. The meaning came from something simpler. Years earlier, he had made a choice. He had chosen responsibility over recognition, presence over prestige, family over ambition. Many people assumed such choices required sacrifice. Looking at Emily now, Daniel understood something they did not. The choice had never been a sacrifice. It had been an investment. And now he was watching the return. As father and daughter reached the truck, Emily stopped suddenly. Can I ask something? Always. If all of this had never happened, would you still be happy? Daniel did not need time to think. Yes. Emily smiled. Good. Why? She opened the passenger door and climbed inside. Because I would still have the same dad. Daniel stood there for a moment as the words settled around him. Then he quietly closed the door and walked around to the driver's side. The engine started. The truck pulled away. The school disappeared behind them. Ahead stretched an ordinary road beneath a beautiful sky. And in the peaceful silence that followed, there was no need for applause, titles, or explanations. The greatest achievement in Daniel Brooks's life was already sitting beside him, and for a moment, the entire world seemed perfectly still.